She calls on you to greet her, combing her dripping crown. And if you go to meet her, she ups and drags you down. To start a channel about folklore in Staffordshire and neglect what is arguably its most famous folktale would be incredibly foolish. The story of the Mermaid of the Black Mere is an old one, which legend has it, has claimed many a young man's life over the years. The lake has a few different names: Blakemere Pond, the Mermaid Pool, but perhaps the most well attested is the Black Mere of Morwich. Mere, of course, is a word for a lake that comes from the Old Saxon Meri. Morwich is a contraction of Moor Ridge, which is where you can find it. Right on the opposite side of Staffordshire than the Black Country, on the borders of the Peak District moorland, sits the Mere, approximately 6 miles northwest of Leek. The lake is a natural one, being there as long as records exist. The water is approximately 50 yards in diameter and roughly circular. The water, as name suggests, is an opaque black and is held by legend to be bottomless. Today, it is speculated the local fascination with this lake may date back into the days of our pagan ancestors, when it may have been used as a site of religious significance. From C.S. Byrne on the topic of similar lakes: the belief in bottomless pools and dwellings beneath the waters is plainly traceable to the old heathen idea of the netherworld, where lived the gods of the waters or of the mines, just as the gods of the upper air had their habitation in the clouds above. It was believed to be a real, solid, material place, easily accessible to visitors from above. So Orpheus found it, and Odin, when he took horse and rode thither to learn the fate of Balder. The mermaid is described as a beautiful young woman who enchants young men with her singing voice. As locals will tell you, the ideal time to see her is at midnight after rain on the day of Easter. Though if you travel there on any dark night in a storm, you are said to catch a glimpse of the will-o'-the-wisps that keep her company. If she favours you, she will grant you a boon, perhaps even as much as immortality. But if she takes offence to your presence, she will drag you, kicking and screaming down into the black, bottomless waters, never to be heard from again. She is the rare example of an inland mermaid, and nobody knows her name. She has been there long enough no one can agree how she arrived at the pool. There are broadly 2 different tales, but many smaller variations. I will also propose for the first time a third that I have deduced from my own research. The first tale is that of a young man named Joshua Linnet, who lived in a village nearby. In this same village was a girl who his heart was set upon, for she was young and beautiful, and had always shown him kindness, which is often enough to turn the heads of men. But this girl rejected Joshua's advances, breaking his heart. Wounded by this, Joshua riled a mob of village folk under the story that the girl was a witch, which importantly, in some versions of the tale, she was, and he had not been rejected, merely horrified to discover this. The villagers tied her to a cooking stool and thrust her into the icy black waters of the lake to see if she would drown. As she began to choke and freeze and struggle for what life remained her, she shouted a curse upon Joshua and all men of his ilk before succumbing to her ordeal. Some felt her death proved her innocence, others that the curse she proclaimed proved her guilt, and they were well rid of her. Days passed, with the moors shrouded in mist, and a feeling of ominous melancholy. On the third night, there was a raging storm. This was the night Joshua went missing. In the morning, they found his house empty, hearth still smouldering gently, and a set of men's boot prints led away and onto the moors, towards the Black Mere. Following it, they saw the waters for the first time the colour of wine, as Joshua's lifeless body floated upon the surface. Upon retrieving it, they noticed his eyes had been gouged from his head, and his body was patterned all over by deep claw marks. The mermaid, a spirit of the girl, had been born, and Joshua would not be her last victim. If this tale is true, then I would imagine that married men, or those of pure heart, have little to fear from her. But if you're a man that's less lucky with women, and this has twisted your opinion of them into one of spite, I would steer well clear of this area of moorland, lest you remind the mermaid too much of her accuser. The second tale is that of an unnamed sailor, a man who came from the nearby village of Thorncliffe. One day, while out on the sea, his ship fell afoul of a storm and was broken in two. As the only survivor clinging to a piece of driftwood, he was near death when he finally washed ashore on the beach of a small, otherwise uninhabited island. It was here he met with the tender mermaid, an ancient, immortal, and ethereal being who took pity upon this man and nursed him back to health. As is a familiar story, this brought them very close, even in love. Eventually, the sailor was rescued, and the mermaid followed the ship back to England. Reunited, he smuggled her onto the land. But she could not be away from water for long, or she would begin to die. Knowing the Black Mere was already mostly avoided due to its ill reputation, he brought her here as a place where he could daily visit her and continue their love. For years this worked, but the mermaid was immortal. The sailor was not. He began to age, and his health to fail, and the long walk up the hills into the moorlands increasingly took its toll. Initially, this just meant he arrived later each day, but as bouts of sickness made him bedbound, he would begin to be absent for long periods of time, until one day the sailor passed away peacefully in his sleep. His love waited, assuming it was just another bout of illness, and waited, until eventually she came to accept the reality that her love had gone, and she had never been given the chance to say a proper farewell. She would never embrace him again. This grief is what drove her to the edge of madness. But what pushed her over was the isolation. The lake was already largely avoided, which is why they had never had any trouble. But now, due to rumours of the mad mermaid of the Mere, none dared go anywhere near it. Without an accomplice, there was no way either for her to return to the sea. The Peak District is about as landlocked as you can get in the UK, and she would dry out and die if she attempted to leave by herself. As years and eventually decades passed, her grief turned to regret, and eventually to unbridled rage as realization set in. She had traded a single lifetime of love with a human for an eternity in her black prison. This is where she waits to this day, where she will always wait, until she is released again. The third tale will require more context, and here, as is my habit, I will begin to explore more thoroughly the history of the lake. I say lake where modern residents say pool or pond, because at one point the mere was far larger than it currently stands. At some point in the late 17th century, we do not know exactly when, a trench was dug on the western side to drain it off, the remains of which can still be seen today. The story is that when the work was underway, the mermaid appeared before the workmen and told them that if the waters were allowed to escape, she would drown all of Leek and Leek Frith. We do know the mermaid hasn't always been there. Indeed, in mentions of the lake predating the 17th century, she's never referred to at all. And the nearby inn up the road, which is now called the Mermaid Inn, is a 17th century Grade II listed coach inn, originally called Blakemere House. The name changed with the arrival of the mermaid legend, and has led some to speculate it was invented as a marketing tool by the owners of the inn. The poem I read in the beginning of this video used to hang on a wall of the bar. The inn is no longer public, and the whole house must now be rented in a group Airbnb style arrangement from the owners. The lake, though, as I have said, is ancient, far more so than any map of the area. The earliest recorded mention is thought to be in a poem called De Lacu in Staffordia by Alexander Neckham, from his larger work Laus Sapiente Divinae, written circa 1213. This was translated into English by William Camden in 1722, thusly: Of a lake in Staffordshire, a lake that with prophetic noise doth roar, where beasts can ne'er be forced to venture o'er, by hounds, or men, or fleeter death pursued. They'll not plunge in, but shun the hated flood. Later, in 1686, before it was drained to its current level, it was investigated by Robert Plot in his Natural History of Staffordshire, who took a far less mystical view on it. He said, "The water is of the Black Mere of Morwich, which I take to be nothing more than such as those in the peat pits. Though it confidently be reported that no cattle will drink of it, no bird lie on it or fly over it, all of which are as false as that it is bottomless, it being found upon measure scarce 4 yards in the deepest place. My horse is also drinking as freely as I ever saw him at any other place, and the fowl so far from declining to fly over it, that I spoke with several that had seen geese upon it. So that I take this to be as good as the rest, notwithstanding the vulgar disrepute it lies under." Though Mr. Plot is sure in the relatively shallow nature of the pool, which has been investigated and confirmed more recently, this does not stop sightings of the mermaid at the nearby Doxley Pool, and, as such, locals are convinced the two pools are connected by an underground stream. Even before the arrival of the mermaid, of course, the mere was the site of various murders and foul deeds. One such is recalled in Volume 3 of the Reliquary. The story is that of a poor woman, enticed to the Black Mere on a dismal, stormy night by a bloody ruffian who had first gotten her with child, and intended in this remote, inhospitable place to have her dispatched by drowning. That same night, Providence so ordering it, there were several persons of inferior rank drinking in an alehouse at Leek, whereof one, having been out and observing the darkness and other ill circumstances of the weather, coming in again, said to the rest of his companions that he were a stout man indeed who would venture to go to the Black Mere of Morwich in such a night as that. to which one of them replying that for a crown, or some such sum, he would undertake it. The rest, joining their purses, said he should have his demand. The bargain being struck, away he went on his journey with a stick in his hand, which he was to leave there as testimony of his performance. At length, coming near the moor, he heard the lamentable cries of this distressed woman begging for mercy, which at first put him to a stand. But being a man of great resolution and some policy, he went boldly on, however counterfeiting the presence of others, calling Jack, Dick, Tom, and crying, "Here are the rogues we'd look for," which, being heard by the murderer, he left the woman and fled, whom the other man found by the mere side, almost stripped of her clothes, and brought her with him to Leek, as ample testimony of his having been at the mere, and of God's providence too. Which brings me to my own origin theory, the third of such. Charlotte Byrne recalls in her book, Shropshire Folklore Volume 3, about a mermaid of Newport who lived in a pool in a marsh area known as the Wildmoors. This pool was gone by 1749. The mermaid though survived, and somehow made it to her new home, Aqualate Mere in Staffordshire on its west boundary, 2 miles higher up than the moors. Charlotte relates how after her relocation, upon seeing the dredging operations being undertaken in Aqualate Mere, mistook their intention for that of draining her new home. Remembering the loss of her first home in Newport, she warned them, "If this mere you do let dry, Newport and Meretown I will destroy." A warning which is similar, if not near identical, to the warning given in Leek. So I put it to you, if Newport and Aqualate were perhaps joined by an underwater stream that allowed this mermaid to escape the draining, and Doxley and Blakemere are as well, could there be a connection between all of them? Could all 4 sightings be the same, single, inland mermaid? It would certainly explain why she is not always seen in any one pool at a time. And the timelines match up for her sudden appearance after the draining of the pool in Newport. Whatever the truth, while I did not see her myself on my visit, I did see something curious. On the eastern bank nearest the road, there were a load of components of old cars and machinery that had very clearly been sitting for a long time in the Blackmere. They appeared to have been thrown, or perhaps dragged, out of the lake. It cannot be the result of rising water because of how neatly and closely they are piled. And if this was some anonymous Good Samaritan or environmentalist, why would they leave the remains on the bank, rather than remove them entirely? An angry mermaid doing spring cleaning is not the most difficult to believe of explanations. I'll leave you then with one more historical account of the mere, from the Christian Messenger, written in 1871. On Morridge, darkness comes down suddenly, and in uttermost density. Few persons pass over the moor in the night. Not unfrequently the whole world is lost to the night pedestrian from Warslow to Leek, and not a star nor a stone remains. Nothing, absolutely nothing, but pitch darkness. Mr. William Close and Mr. John Wedgwood walked till they felt the ground giving way beneath them. It was time to look closely at their feet, for they were walking on the sedgy, boggy verge of the Blackmere. One could almost hear their hearts beat, and the deep, long-drawn breath as they stood over the black water, in which legend said the mermaid had risen and announced to an astonished moorlander that if the water broke through the hillside, it would destroy Leek and Leekfrith, and carry desolation and amazement along the Vale of Chernan. No such events were transpiring where their travellers found themselves by the side of the mere. But they were lost, and had become nervous. Then, the voice which afterwards called tens of thousands of sinners to repentance was born in the desert air. "Lost! Lost! Lost!" Mr. Close called, and the wind whistled mournfully round the spires of the wiregrass and among the tufts of gorse bushes. "Lost! Lost! Lost!" And then a dog barked, and voices were heard, probably of poachers, possibly of robbers and murderers, and then a stampede commenced. Tumbling walls and deep ditches were passed. Unseen moss pits, quarries, and gorges were passed. 20 dangers were incurred in fleeing from what was possibly only a superstitious one.